Silas Greer's hand came down so hard across the table that the oil lamp jumped and nearly fell. "You think you can just disappear?" he said. "You think I don't own those girls the same as I owned their father's debts?" Ruth didn't flinch. She had learned, after 2 years living under Silas Greer's roof, that flinching only made him worse. She stood in the kitchen doorway, with Emmy pressed against her hip and Nora standing just behind her, and she kept her face as still as creek water in January. "They are my daughters," Ruth said. "They are collateral," Silas said, "and so are you." That was the night Ruth Callaway decided she would rather die in a Wyoming blizzard than spend one more winter in that house. And she nearly did. If you've ever had to choose between an impossible road and a certain kind of ruin, if you've ever packed everything that mattered into a single bag and walked out a door not knowing whether you'd survive what was on the other side, then you already understand something about Ruth. And if you haven't, then stay with this story, because by the end of it, you just might. Before we go further, if this is the kind of story that reaches something in you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Ruth's journey all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Ruth Callaway had been a widow for 14 months when she answered the advertisement in the back of the Cheyenne Territorial Gazette. The ad was small, wedged between a notice for a missing mule and a land surveyor's announcement. It read, "Rancher, 34, seeking capable woman for partnership in household and livestock operation. Honest correspondence preferred. Write to Jesse Hawkins, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory." She had read it 3 times standing in the cold post office, her breath fogging the air, Emmy on her hip, and Nora tugging at her coat sleeve asking if they could please go home. Ruth didn't answer Nora. She was thinking about what home meant now, and whether the words still applied to anything in her life. Her husband Calvin had been dead since the previous October, a logging accident outside Casper that left her with 2 daughters, a rented room above a dry goods store, and a brother-in-law who had decided, in the way that certain men decide things, that her situation made her his responsibility. Silas Greer was Calvin's older brother by 11 years, and he was the kind of man who expressed concern the way a rope expresses restraint, tightly, without asking permission, cutting off the circulation to everything underneath. He had moved them into his house 2 months after the funeral, when the rent ran out. He told her it was temporary. He told her it was practical. He told her the girls needed stability, and that Ruth alone was not stability. She had believed him long enough to pack her bags and cross the threshold of his house on Merchant Street, and she had spent the following year understanding, slowly and then all at once, exactly what that decision had cost her. It wasn't one large thing. It was never one large thing with men like Silas. It was the small accumulations, the way he spoke over her at dinner, the way he redirected Nora's questions to himself before Ruth could answer, the way he held Emmy sometimes too long, too firmly, his eyes going somewhere Ruth didn't want to follow. It was the way he said "our girls" when he spoke to neighbors, the way he had begun, in the past few months, to discuss Ruth's future in the third person, as if she were not in the room, as if her preferences were a quaint formality he had already processed and set aside. The night before she found the advertisement, Silas had sat her down at the kitchen table and explained, with the particular patience of a man who has already made up his mind, that he had spoken to Reverend Alderman about a possible arrangement, that Ruth needed someone to help manage this household decisions, that the girls needed a father figure, that Silas was prepared to make that sacrifice, if Ruth would simply be reasonable about what her options actually were. Ruth had sat very still and listened to all of it. She had nodded in the places that seemed to require nodding. She had said she would think on it, and Silas had looked satisfied in the way that men look satisfied when they believe the outcome is already settled and the other person simply hasn't caught up yet. That night, after the house went quiet, Ruth had gone through Silas's coat pocket, the one he left on the hook by the back door, and found the coin purse she had seen him use at the feed store. She had taken what she calculated she was owed, 3 months of unpaid labor, minus the rent for the room, minus her share of the food. She was not proud of it. She was also not sorry. She wrapped the coins in her spare underskirt, tucked Emmy and Nora's warmest clothing into her traveling bag alongside her own, and sat on the edge of the bed until 4 in the morning. Then she got up, woke the girls quietly, and walked out the back door into the dark. Stagecoach office opened at 6. By the time the sun came up, Ruth Callaway and her daughters were on the first coach heading northwest, and Silas Greer was still asleep. She had already written to Jesse Hawkins. She had sent the letter 3 weeks before, on a morning when Silas was at the mill, composing it carefully at the kitchen table, in handwriting she had kept deliberately plain. She described herself honestly, widowed, 31, capable of hard work, experienced with livestock from her years on her father's farm in Nebraska. She said she was a serious woman looking for a serious arrangement, and that she was not interested in promises, only in honest effort. She did not mention Nora. She did not mention Emmy. She told herself she would explain in person when it was too late for him to simply not respond. She told herself a lot of things in those weeks that she has since had to answer for. Jesse Hawkins had written back in 8 days, which was faster than she expected. His letter was short and unornamented, written in a hand that pressed hard into the paper, like a man accustomed to fighting resistance in everything. Mrs. Callaway, your letter was direct, which I appreciate. I have a working ranch that needs another pair of hands and a decent head attached to them. I am not looking for sentiment, only reliability. If you are willing to come out and see whether the situation suits, I will have someone meet the stage at Millard Creek on the 14th. Jesse Hawkins. Not a single warm word in the whole thing. Ruth had found that reassuring. She was not, she told herself, looking for warmth. She was looking for a door. The stagecoach took 2 days. First day passed without incident. Emmy slept across Ruth's lap most of the afternoon, her small face slack and trusting in the way children's faces are when they haven't yet understood that the world doesn't guarantee their safety. Nora sat with her back very straight, watching the terrain change outside the window with the expression she had developed over the past years, cautious, measuring, already too old for 7. Ruth watched her daughters and thought about what she was doing to them. She thought about it in the specific, searing way that mothers think about their own decisions when there is no one else to share the weight of them. She was pulling them out of a warm house in December. She was taking them to live with a stranger. She was gambling their safety on a letter and a handshake that hadn't even happened yet, because the alternative was something she had decided, with the clarity that comes at 4 in the morning, she could not allow. She reached over and smoothed a loose strand of hair back from Nora's face. Nora leaned slightly into her hand. Barely perceptibly, the way she had started doing, since the autumn, seeking contact, rather than asking for it, as if asking had become something she no longer trusted herself to do. Are we almost there? Nora asked. Tomorrow, Ruth said. What's it like? Ruth looked out the window at the gray flat sky pulling down over the hills. I don't know yet, she said. We'll find out together. Nora considered this with the seriousness of someone twice her age. Okay, she said and turned back to the window. Emmy hadn't spoken in 2 months, not since the night in October when Silas had found her in the back parlor, and Ruth had come in to find Emmy standing in the corner absolutely rigid, both hands pressed flat against the wall, and Silas explaining in a perfectly reasonable voice that they had only been playing a game. Ruth had taken Emmy upstairs and held her for an hour, and after that night Emmy had simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with tears or any visible event that a doctor could point to. She just went quiet, as if she had decided that language was a door she no longer wished to open. The doctor and Casper had said it sometimes happened with children who experienced a fright, that she would likely talk again in her own time. He said this with the confidence of a man who had not sat across a kitchen table from Silas Greer, and understood what kind of fright he meant. Ruth had nodded and taken Emmy home, and that night begun composing her letter to Jay Hawkins. The second day of the journey, the weather changed. Started as a grayness that thickened. The way winter in Wyoming thickens not gradually but in sudden compressions, sky pressing down in increments until the light goes amber, and then pewter, and then something that barely qualifies as light at all. The driver had said that morning there might be weather coming. Said it, the way men say it out in that country, which means they have looked at the sky and made their peace with whatever it intends. By noon, the wind had picked up. By mid-afternoon, the first snow was coming in sideways, and the coach was rocking on its wheels with each gust. The other two passengers, a dry goods merchant from Rawlins and an older woman traveling to visit her son, had pulled their coats tight and gone silent, with the particular silence of people who are paying very close attention to sounds outside the vehicle. Emmy was pressed against Ruth's side, her eyes open and watchful. Nora had stopped asking questions. Ruth felt the exact moment the driver lost his grip on the situation. It wasn't a sound or a lurch or any dramatic signal. It was a change in the rhythm of the horses, a hesitation in the forward motion, and then the coach veered slightly left, corrected, veered again. And the merchant said, "Lord Almighty," very quietly, and then the whole apparatus shuddered to a stop. The driver was down when they opened the door. He had fallen from the box, they found out later. His hands had simply frozen, gone useless on him in a matter of minutes, with the temperature dropping as fast as it was. He was alive when Ruth climbed out and crouched over him, but barely conscious, and she could see the bluish color spreading at the edges of his fingers. They got him inside the coach. The merchant and the older woman tried to warm him, but the coach itself was losing heat rapidly with the storm coming on full. Ruth stood in the doorway of the coach and looked out at the white that was replacing the world. And she made the kind of calculation that only becomes possible when you have already spent months inside a situation that should have been impossible, and found a way through it anyway. She knew roughly where they were. She had been watching the terrain, measuring the time. Jesse Hawkins's ranch, if the letter was accurate and the driver had been on schedule, should be somewhere between 3 and 5 miles north. In fair weather, a walk. In this weather, a different kind of proposition entirely. She looked at Emmy. Emmy looked back at her, silent, her face pale but steady. She looked at Nora. Nora said, "Mama?" And the question in her voice was, "It's not are we safe, it was what do you need me to do?" Ruth wanted to sit down and cry. She didn't have time for that. She told the merchant she was going for help. He told her she was going to die. She said she'd rather die trying than freeze waiting, and he had no real answer for that. She wrapped Emmy in everything extra she could find in the bag, her own spare dress layered over Emmy's coat, Nora's scarf over that. She picked Emmy up and settled her against her chest, and Emmy wrapped both small arms around Ruth's neck without being told, pressing her cold cheek against Ruth's jaw. "I need you to hold on," Ruth said quietly against Emmy's hair. "Can you do that for me?" Emmy pressed tighter. That was answer enough. Nora took hold of Ruth's coat at the back, a single fistful of wool, and that was how they went out into the blizzard. Ruth leading, Emmy pressed against her chest, Nora anchored behind. First 100 yards were the worst. The wind hit them like something with opinions, directed and insistent, pushing against their forward motion with a force that required conscious physical effort to resist. Ruth bent into it. She kept her eyes down, and her arm curved over Emmy's back, and she moved her feet because the alternative was to stop moving. And she had decided in the clean, cold, exhausted space that comes after the point where fear runs out that she was not going to stop. Counted steps when the cold got bad enough that she needed something to hold on to other than direction. Counted them in groups of 50, and when she reached 50, she started again. Emmy had stopped moving against her chest, which terrified her, but when she pressed her lips to the top of Emmy's head, she could feel warmth, and she told herself warmth meant alive, and she kept counting. Nora never let go, not once. Her fist stayed knotted in the back of Ruth's coat for the entire distance, and Ruth could feel her daughter's weight leaning into her when the wind peaked, and she thought, She trusts me to keep going. And that thought was the thing that carried her through the last half mile, when her legs had stopped feeling like legs and had become something else, something mechanical, something that worked on its own agreement with the ground, separate from whatever Ruth's mind was doing above them. She did not see the lights until she was almost through the gate, a glow in the white, faint and orange-yellow, coming from the outline of a structure she could not fully make out. She moved toward it without thinking, the way you move toward any warmth when you have been without it long enough. She crossed a yard she couldn't see. She climbed steps she could only find by feel. She raised her fist, her right hand, the one that wasn't holding Emmy, and she knocked on a door she could barely distinguish from the wall around it. She knocked hard, because she did not have a second attempt in her. Door opened. The man in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, backlit by firelight, his expression shifting rapidly through several things as he took in what was standing on his porch, a woman soaked through, a small child bundled against her chest, another child gripping the woman's coat with both hands, all three of them half white with ice and snow. He said, "What in the Jesse Hawkins?" Ruth said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Yes, I'm Ruth Callaway," she said. "I wrote you a letter." She felt Emmy's grip loosen slightly against her neck, the particular loosening of a child who's decided it can finally afford to let go, and she stepped forward across the threshold before Jesse Hawkins had finished processing any of it. "My youngest is very cold," Ruth said. "I need to get her warm." He moved out of her way. She went through the door. The fire was the first thing that mattered. Jesse had a good one, going in the main room he'd built it up before the storm hit. The way men who live alone in Wyoming learn to do, reading weather the way other people read faces. The hearth was wide and deep, and the wood was dry. And when Ruth carried Emmy through the door and crossed toward it, she moved with the single-mindedness of a woman who has made her peace with everything except this one remaining task. She lowered herself to the floor in front of the fire dyer, still holding Emmy, and began unwrapping the layers, the spare dress, Nora's scarf, the child's own coat, working with fingers that had mostly stopped cooperating, forcing them through the motions anyway. Emmy's face, when it emerged, was pale in the wrong way, the color of river ice, and her lips had a bluish cast that made Ruth's chest clench hard enough to hurt. "Emmy," she said, "look at me." Emmy's eyes moved to her face, slow but present. "Good girl," Ruth said. "Stay with me now." Nora had come in behind her and shut the door. Ruth heard it close and registered it with the part of her mind that was still keeping track of logistics, and now stood a few feet back, dripping onto the floorboards, watching her sister with an expression that was too controlled for a 7-year-old. The effort of that control was visible in the set of her jaw, the way she was holding her hands together at her waist. Jesse had not moved from near the door. Ruth was aware of him in her peripheral vision, a large, still presence, the particular stillness of a man who has been surprised badly enough that he needs a moment before he can act. She didn't blame him. She didn't have space to blame him. She pulled Emmy closer to the fire and rubbed her hands up and down the child's arms through the thin layer of her dress, steady and fast, generating friction. "Is there a blanket?" Ruth asked. She didn't look up. A pause. Then she heard him move, and a moment later, a heavy wool blanket dropped over her shoulders and Emmy both. She pulled it around the child and kept rubbing. "Water," she said. "Warm if you have it." Another pause. Then the sound of movement toward what she assumed was the kitchen. Nora came and crouched beside her without being asked, adding her own small hands to the effort, rubbing Emmy's feet through her stockings, which was exactly the right thing to do. And Ruth felt a particular kind of grief at that, the grief of recognizing that your 7-year-old already knows how to respond in an emergency because she has had too many opportunities to practice. Emmy began to shiver. Ruth took that as a good sign. Shivering meant the body was still fighting and held her tighter, wrapping the blanket more fully around them both and leaning so that her own body heat contributed to the equation. Fire crackled and popped beside them. Somewhere in the house there were sounds of a man moving around a kitchen. He knew well. The specific, efficient sounds of someone who lives alone and has learned to do everything without help. Jesse came back with a tin cup of water that was warm but not hot he'd had, some sitting near the stove. Ruth guessed, the way people out here often did in winter. Crouched down to offer it, and that was the first time Ruth really looked at him. He was not what she had pictured. She wasn't sure exactly what she had pictured from that spare, hard-pressed letter, but it wasn't this, a face that was weathered past its age, creased in ways that had nothing to do with smiling. Dark eyes that were currently fixed on Emmy, with an expression Ruth could not quite categorize. Not cold, not warm. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man who has trained himself not to feel things quickly and is currently losing that argument. How old is she? He asked. 4, Ruth said. He looked at Nora. 7, Nora said, before he could ask. She said it with her chin up slightly, the way she said most things to men she didn't know preemptively, as if establishing information early reduced the chances of being caught off guard later. Jesse looked at Nora for a moment, then looked at Ruth. Ruth held his gaze and waited. She knew what was coming. She had known it since she stepped through his door. She had been composing her response to it for 3 weeks, ever since she posted the letter, and she had 17 different versions of it, and none of them had ever felt quite adequate. And standing here soaking wet with ice in her hair and her youngest child shivering in her arms, she had a feeling that adequate was no longer really available as an option anyway. Jesse stood up. He didn't say anything yet. He went back to the kitchen, and Ruth heard him doing something. She thought it was putting more water to heat, and then he came back and stood near the fire with his arms crossed, looking at her with the expression of a man who is deciding whether to be angry before he has all the information. Your letter, he said, did not mention children. No, Ruth said, it didn't. 2 of them. Yes. His jaw moved. That's a significant detail to leave out of a correspondence between adults entering into an arrangement. It is, Ruth said. I know that. Then because no man answers an advertisement for a wife if the letter says she comes with 2 daughters, Ruth said. She said it flat and plain and without apology because she was too tired for apology and because it was simply true, and they both knew it was simply true. And she was done pretending otherwise. I made a choice. I knew it wasn't fair. I planned to tell you when I arrived, before anything was decided. You planned to tell me after you were already here, he said. Yes, that's not what you just said. It is exactly what I said, Ruth said. I said before anything was decided. I did not say before I arrived. Those are different things. Jesse looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Emmy, who was still pressed against Ruth's chest, her color coming back by degrees. Then he looked at Nora, who was watching him with those measuring eyes. What happened to your husband? He asked. Logging accident, 14 months ago. And you've been on your own since. Ruth thought of Silas's house, of the kitchen table and the coin purse and the back door in the dark. More or less, she said. He heard the qualification. She could tell, by the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his gaze moved over her face as if reading something she hadn't said aloud. He didn't push it. She didn't know yet whether that was courtesy or disinterest, and she didn't have the energy to figure it out. Emmy made a small sound, not a word. Just a sound, a soft exhalation against Ruth's collarbone, and Jesse's attention went immediately to her. Something in his face shifted when it did, some small movement in the jaw or around the eyes there and gone. She's warming up, Nora said. She said it to Jesse directly, which surprised Ruth because Nora rarely addressed men she didn't know without being spoken to first. Jesse looked at Nora. Seems like it, he said. Nora studied him for another moment. Then she went back to rubbing Emmy's feet. The storm threw itself against the house with a sound like something trying to get in, and the 3 of them stayed where they were in front of the fire, and Jesse Hawkins stood in his own living room, looking at the ruins of the arrangement he had believed he was entering into, and nobody said anything for a while. Fed them. That was the next thing. He didn't make a production of it, didn't announce it, or ask if they were hungry. Just disappeared into the kitchen, and came back a while later, Zbean, with a pot of beans that had been sitting at the back of the stove, some cornbread that was a day old, and a wedge of hard cheese. He set it on the low table near the fire and stepped back, and Ruth looked at the food and felt something in her throat that she refused to let become anything more visible than a tight swallow. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went to stand near the window, looking out at the storm. Ruth helped Emmy sit up enough to eat, supporting her against one arm while spooning beans with the other. Emmy ate slowly, without enthusiasm, but she ate. Nora ate the way children eat when they've been frightened and haven't had the chance to think about being hungry until the danger passes quickly and without talking, working through the food with a focus that was almost mechanical. Ruth ate what was left. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Jesse ate nothing. She noticed that. He had served them what he had and kept none of it for himself. And when she glanced over at him, he was still at the window, arms crossed, watching the darkness. "The driver went down," Ruth said. "He's in the coach, about 3 miles south. The merchant and another passenger are with him, but they don't have much heat." Jesse turned from the window. "How long?" "We walked maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour." He was already moving toward his coat. "In this?" Ruth said. "Can't leave them there," he said, which was the end of that conversation. He was gone for almost 2 hours. During those 2 hours, Ruth got Emmy fully warm and settled on the cot. Jesse had gestured toward, in the corner of the main room, a narrow thing, clearly meant for one, but sufficient for a child. She took off both girls' outer things and hung them near the fire to dry. She wrapped Nora in the second blanket she found, folded on a shelf near the door, and sat with her until Nora's eyes went heavy and closed. Then she sat alone in front of the fire in Jesse Hawkins's house and looked at her hands and thought about the multiple ways this could still go wrong. She thought about Silas, who would have found the coin purse missing by now. Who would be angry in the specific way that Silas got angry, not loudly, not immediately, but with the patient, architectural anger of a man who considers himself owed something and is willing to wait for the right moment to collect. She had bought herself distance. She didn't know yet if she had bought herself enough. Thought about Jesse, out in the blizzard, pulling a stagecoach full of strangers out of the cold. And she thought that was either a very good sign about his character, or simply evidence that he was the kind of stubborn that didn't know when to stay inside, and she wasn't sure yet which one it was. She thought about Emmy, asleep 6 feet away with her cheek pressed against a wool blanket in a stranger's house, breathing with the steadiness that children breathe when they have finally been warm long enough to trust it. She thought, whatever comes next, I got them here. That part is done. It wasn't a comforting thought, exactly. It was more like a marker on a trail, not the destination, just evidence that she had covered the distance so far. Jesse came back with snow on every surface of him, and 3 more people crowding in through the door. Behind him, the merchant, the older woman, and the driver supported between 2 of them. He got the driver to the chair closest to the fire, and the others settled, and he did all of this without fuss, without instruction, with the particular competence of a man who has handled emergencies alone, often enough that the presence of other people in the situation is almost incidental. When it was done, he looked at Ruth across the room. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, because everything that needed to be said right now was still too complicated for the available language, and they both seemed to know it. Storm kept on. The house held. By morning, the snow had stopped and the world outside was buried and white and absolutely still in the way that Wyoming gets after a big blow, a silence so complete it feels imposed, like the landscape itself is catching its breath. The merchant and the older woman had slept in the chairs near the fire. The driver was doing better. His fingers had color, and he was coherent enough to drink coffee and be grateful about it. Jesse had slept somewhere. Ruth didn't know where, didn't think it had been much. She was up before the others, because she was always up before the others. She had found the kitchen by the simple method of walking until she found it, and had located flour, lard, salt, and a cast iron skillet, and she was making biscuits when she heard him behind her. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I know," Ruth said, and kept working. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She heard him decide not to argue with that, and then she heard him go to the stove and add wood, and then the sound of the coffee pot being lifted and checked. "Coffee's still good from last night," she said. "I put it back to warm." A pause. "All right." She put the biscuits in the oven that she had spent 10 minutes figuring out the specific temperament of, because every wood-fired oven had its own opinions about heat distribution, and turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at Jesse Hawkins in the early morning light coming through the kitchen window. He looked worse than she'd thought last night. Not physically, he was clearly capable of handling physical difficulty. That much was obvious. But there was something around his eyes, a texture of exhaustion that wasn't just one night of bad sleep, but something older, something that had been there a while and had simply become part of his face. She had seen that look before, on people who had lost something they hadn't found a way to put down yet. "I know I put you in an impossible position," Ruth said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to pretend it's all right." Jesse poured coffee into a cup. He didn't say anything. "Stay," she said. "Through the winter, at least. I can work. I know what that means. I grew up on a farm. I'm not afraid of livestock or heavy labor or cold or any of it. I can cook. I can keep a house. I can help with whatever the operation needs." She paused. "My daughters won't be a burden. Nora is capable of real work. Emmy is—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Emmy will get better." Jesse turned around with his coffee cup and looked at her directly, for the first time this morning. "What's wrong with her?" Ruth chose her words carefully. She had a fright. Some months ago, she stopped talking. Stopped talking. "Yes, completely?" "Yes." Absorbed this. "A doctor seen her?" "Yes, he said she'll talk when she's ready." Jesse looked down at his coffee. Something moved across his face. Not pity. Something more complicated than pity. Something that suggested he had at least a partial understanding of what it meant for a person to go quiet because the world had given them sufficient reason. "What kind of fright?" he asked. Ruth met his eyes. "The kind that involves a man who should have known better." The kitchen was quiet, except for the fire in the stove, and the sound of the biscuits beginning to fill the air with something that smelled like civilization. Jesse held her gaze for a moment and then looked away, and he did it in a way that told her he had understood exactly what she meant, and he did not require her to be more specific. "The merchant and the woman will be heading out today," he said. "Once I can dig out the road enough to get the coach moving. The driver's going to need a day. I can look after him," Ruth said. "I know you can," he said it, without inflection, but it wasn't dismissive. It was straightforward acknowledgement, the way a practical man acknowledges a practical fact. Ruth waited. Jesse drank his coffee and stared at the wall above her head for a moment, and she could almost watch him working through the arithmetic of the situation, what he'd expected, what he'd gotten, what the costs were of each possible decision from here. "The north fence needs restringing before spring," he said finally. "About a quarter mile of it came down in November. The root cellar's in poor shape. I haven't had time to address it, which means half the stores are at risk if the temperature drops below a certain point. The barn roof leaks in 2 places, and I've been putting off fixing it because I needed 2 sets of hands. I've got cattle that need checking twice a day, and a horse with a leg that's been giving trouble that I haven't been able to properly poultice because there's always something else that needs doing first." He stopped, looked at her. "That's what the operation looks like." Ruth looked back at him steadily. "All right, it's not an easy situation." "I didn't come here looking for easy," she said. He nodded very slowly, like a man who has just agreed to something he isn't entirely sure about, and knows it, but is doing it anyway. "You can have the room off the kitchen," he said. "The girls can share the cot for now. I'll build a second one when the weather breaks." "That's more than fair," Ruth said. "I'm not doing it to be fair," Jesse said, which was an honest thing to say, and they both stood with that honesty in the air between them for a moment, before he set his cup down and went to get his coat to go start digging out the road. What Ruth hadn't expected was Nora. She had expected Nora to be watchful, measured, slow to trust all of which she was. What she hadn't anticipated was the specific quality of Nora's watchfulness the way it was less like fear and more like a very careful scientific observation. Nora watched Jesse the way Ruth had seen her watch new animals at market when she was younger, tracking movement and tone, cataloging behavior, constructing a theory of temperament from accumulated evidence. She did not speak to him unnecessarily, but she did not hide from him either, which was already different from how she had behaved with Silas in those last months, when she had developed the habit of leaving rooms when Silas entered them. Jesse, for his part, did not try to engage Nora. He did not make cheerful conversation at her. He did not crouch down to her level with the forced warmth that adults sometimes deploy at children in lieu of actual attentiveness. He simply went about his work, and if Nora happened to be nearby, he acknowledged her with the same level of attention he gave everything else, direct and without pretense. On the second morning, Nora followed him to the barn. Ruth watched from the kitchen window, flour on her hands, heart sitting somewhere in the upper part of her chest. She watched Nora trail behind Jesse across the snow-packed yard, keeping about 10 feet of distance, her breath clouding in the cold air. Jesse glanced back once, registered her presence, and kept walking. He didn't say, "Come here." He didn't say, "Stay back." He just went into the barn and left the door open. Nora stood outside it for almost a full minute. Then she went in. Ruth turned back to the bread she was making and pressed her hands into the dough and breathed. Emmy was a different problem. Emmy had always been a different problem, which was not a criticism. It was simply the acknowledgement that some children absorb the world through their skin in ways that others don't, and Emmy was that kind of child. She felt things at a frequency that most people couldn't detect. She had been talking from the time she was 18 months, whole sentences by 2, paragraphs by 3 verbal in the way some children are, as if language was the primary method by which she organized herself against the world. And then the world had provided her with a reason to stop, and she had stopped. She watched Jesse from a distance, closer than she had watched Silas. She had watched from behind furniture, but still from a distance, still with both exits visible, still with that particular quality of readiness that children develop when they have learned that adults move unpredictably. Jesse did not seem to notice. Or, if he noticed, he gave no indication of it, which Ruth later came to understand was itself a form of consideration, not forcing the child to perform normalcy before she was capable of it. On the third day, Jesse came in from the barn and left something on the kitchen table without explanation. It was a small wooden horse, rough carved, clearly done fast, and without any real pretension toward artistry. The legs were slightly uneven, the mane more suggested than rendered, but it was unmistakably a horse, small enough to fit in a child's palm. Emmy was sitting in the corner of the main room, the way she sat when she was watching and not being watched. She saw it on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the door Jesse had gone back out through. Then she looked at the horse again. She didn't pick it up that day, but she moved her chair 3 feet closer to the table. Ruth saw all of this and said nothing, and carried it with her the way she was carrying a number of things, that week carefully, silently, aware that there were processes underway that could not be forced and could only be damaged by the wrong kind of attention. The roof, the root cellar, the fence, the horse with the bad leg. Ruth got to work. She had not exaggerated her capabilities to Jesse, which she considered a moral baseline. She had been dishonest about the children, but she had not been dishonest about herself, and there was a distinction there that mattered to her. She knew livestock. She knew repair. She knew the particular physical intelligence that comes from growing up on a working farm where everything that breaks stays broken unless someone decides to fix it. The root cellar was the most urgent. She went down there on the second day and assessed it with the same methodical attention she'd given Jesse's oven. On the first morning, noting the draft, coming in at the northeast corner, the soft spot in the insulation along the upper left wall, the way the cold was pooling in the back section, where the more vulnerable stores were kept. She packed the draft with the mixture of clay and straw she found in a bucket near the barn and she rearranged the stores so that the items most at risk were in the warmest section, and she came back upstairs and told Jesse what she'd done and what else still needed doing. He listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, and when she was finished, he said, "The clay pack won't hold past February." "I know," Ruth said. "I need wood strips and a proper seal. Where do you keep your lumber?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her. The problem with the horse's leg was inflammation along the left foreleg. Not a break, but a chronic strain that had been poorly managed, wrapped too tightly at some point, she guessed, which had restricted circulation and caused the inflammation to compound rather than resolve. She unwrapped it and rewrapped it correctly and applied a poultice of boiled flaxseed and clay that she knew from her father's farm. And she did this with Jesse standing behind her, watching. "You've done this before," he said. "Many times," she said. "Where'd you learn it, my father?" she said. "He had draft horses. They were worth more than anything else we had, so you learned to look after them." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "What happened to the farm?" Ruth kept her hands moving on the horse's leg, steady and deliberate. "Father got sick. My mother sold it after. And then I married Calvin," she said. She felt him shift slightly behind her. She didn't explain further, and he didn't ask. The barn was easier than the house in some ways, because the barn had only one function, and everything in it existed toward that function, and Ruth understood functional spaces. She spent time in there every day, learning the rhythms of what Jesse had: the milk cow with the difficult temperament, the 2 draft horses, and the saddle horse, the pigs in the back pen, the dozen or so chickens that had spent the winter in the far corner, and had developed the sour, resigned demeanor of creatures who deeply resent February. Jesse watched her work without commenting on it, which she understood was his version of approval. On the 5th night, they ate together for the first time, without the awkwardness that had characterized the first 4, not comfortably. Not without the particular awareness between 2 adults who are navigating an unusual situation in close proximity, but without the tension that had sat on the meals like weather. Nora talked. She had decided, by some internal calculation Ruth wasn't privy to, that the table was a place where talking was permissible, and so she talked about the chickens, about a bird she'd seen on the barn roof that morning, about whether the snow was going to come back, about a book she had been reading that had apparently been left in the room off the kitchen and which she had taken as available. Jesse listened to all of this with the same attention he gave most things direct and without performance. At one point Nora asked him, "Did you always live here alone?" Table went quiet. Ruth looked at her daughter. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then he said no. Nora waited. The way she waited when she wanted more information, but was willing to be patient about obtaining it. Jesse said, "My wife died 3 years ago." Nora said, "I'm sorry," she said it simply, without fuss, without the elaborate condolence that adults deployed like furniture, just the plain words and the plain meaning. Jesse nodded once. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was level, and then he went back to his food. But Ruth noticed that he ate the rest of the meal with a slightly different quality, to his silence closed off, but present in a different way. Like a man who has said a true thing out loud and found that the world did not end, and is still accounting for that fact. Emmy picked up the wooden horse that night. Ruth didn't see her do it. She only knew because the next morning, when she went to make the girl's bed, the horse was on the pillow beside Emmy's head, tucked there with the particular deliberateness of a child who has decided something is hers now and has positioned it accordingly. She left it there. She went and made breakfast and said nothing about it, and Emmy came out of the room still holding it, and sat at the table still holding it, and ate her biscuits with the horse in her left hand, and at no point did anyone comment on any of this, which was exactly right. Jesse came in from the morning barn work and poured his coffee and sat down and looked across the table at Emmy, who was sitting with the horse. Emmy looked back at him, just for a second. Then she looked at the horse. Jesse drank his coffee. Ruth watched both of them and kept her hands occupied with something at the counter, and she thought, "This is going to take longer than I expected." and it is going to need things that I don't know yet how to provide. And somehow that is still better than any alternative I had. Outside, the wind was coming up again, which meant more weather on the way. The root cellar was sealed. The horse's leg was improving. The roof leak in the barn had been patched with tar paper and a strip of flashing she'd found in the tool corner. None of it was finished. All of it was started. Ruth refilled Jesse's coffee without asking, and he said thank you without looking up, and that was not nothing. That was in the plain arithmetic of a life being rebuilt from its component parts. Actually something. She hadn't told him about Silas yet. That was the thing she was carrying that she hadn't found the right moment to put down. The coin purse. The back door. The letter she'd written to Jesse while Silas was at the mill, and the arrangement Silas had been describing to Reverend Alderman, and the way Silas had said our girls to the neighbors on Merchant Street. She knew she had to tell him. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming before you can see it. The air has a particular quality, a pressure that your body recognizes before your mind has finished processing it. But not yet. Not today. Today the wind was picking up, and the fence needed work, and the milk cow needed her difficult temperament managed, and Emmy had the wooden horse, and Nora was already pulling on her coat to follow Jesse to the barn. Ruth finished the dishes and went to find her work gloves. The fence came first, because the fence was bleeding money. Jesse's had explained it the same way he explained most things, without preamble, without complaint, just the facts laid out in order of importance. Quarter-mile of the north perimeter fence had come down in a November ice storm, and the cattle had been drifting through the gap into the open range beyond, which meant he was spending time almost every other day gathering strays instead of doing the dozen other things that needed doing. He'd patched it twice with what he had on hand. It hadn't held. Ruth went out to look at it on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into January, when the temperature had risen just enough to make outdoor work possible without losing fingers. She walked the damaged section with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes on the posts, and what she saw was not a fence that had failed, but a fence that had been failing for a long time and had simply reached the point where failure became visible. Half the posts were rotted at the base. The wire had been stretched and restretched until it had lost its tension memory. Someone had been maintaining this fence the way people maintain things when they are doing it alone, and there is always something more urgent keeping it functional, just long enough to deal with the next stress and the next one and the next. He came back to the barn where Jesse was working on a harness and told him what she'd found. He listened with his back to her, hands still moving on the leather. I know, he said, though. The posts need replacing, not just the wire, she said. At least 8 of them. I know that, too. Then why? Because posts take 2 people to set correctly in frozen ground, he said. And I've been one person. Ruth stood in the barn doorway for a moment. You have 2 people now, she said. He turned around. He looked at her, not the way he had looked at her in those first days, with the complicated wariness of a man calculating what he'd gotten himself into, but with something more direct than that now. 3 weeks had worn down whatever initial reserve he'd maintained, not to warmth exactly, but to a kind of operational trust. He had seen her rewrap the horse's leg and seal the root cellar, and get the milk cow to cooperate on mornings, when she was being particularly disagreeable about it. And whatever calculation he was running had apparently updated. Ground still frozen hard, he said. We can work around it, Ruth said. Set them in rock packs where the ground won't take them cleanly. It's not perfect, but it'll hold until the thaw, and then we can reset them properly. A pause. He turned back to the harness. All right, he said. They started the next morning. The work was exactly as difficult as Ruth had known it would be, and she did it without complaint, because complaining would have been a form of renegotiating something she had already agreed to. And she did not renegotiate, carried posts. She held them while Jesse drove the rock packs around the bases with a maul, the impact shuddering up through the wood into her arms each time. She strung wire and set tension, and wore through 2 pairs of gloves in 3 days, and at the end of each day her shoulders ached in ways she had to be careful not to show. because she had told Jesse she could do the work, and she intended to be true to that. Nora came out on the second afternoon. She had taken to following Jesse to the barn in the mornings. Ruth had watched this develop with the careful attention she gave most things, waiting to see where it settled. It had settled somewhere that surprised her. Nora wasn't simply trailing Jesse out of curiosity or because she lacked something better to do. She was helping. Small things, handing him tools when he asked, holding a lantern at the angle he needed, filling the water bucket without being told. Jesse accepted her help without comment and without fuss, which was exactly the right response, and Nora had been expanding her participation incrementally ever since, the way a person tests ice one step. Wait, another step, wait. The fence, Nora picked up the task of holding wire segments in place while Ruth set the staples. She was strong for 7, her grip steady, and she didn't complain about the cold either. The three of them worked across the afternoon with the particular efficiency that develops between people who have learned each other's rhythms. And by the time the light started going, they had half the damaged section properly reset. Jesse looked at the work as they gathered tools. He didn't say anything, but he looked at it in the way a man looks at something he's been worrying about and can now stop worrying about quite as much. On the walk back to the house, Nora fell into step beside Jesse. Ruth was behind them, carrying the wire spool, and she watched her daughter match her stride to the much longer stride of the man beside her, with the unconscious adjustments of a child who has decided, apparently, that this particular piece of ground is safe. My dad used to fix things, Nora said. Jesse kept walking. Did he? He wasn't very good at it, Nora said. He always had to do things twice. Mama usually just did it herself the second time. That sounds about right, Jesse said. Were you good at fixing things? Depends on the thing. Nora considered this. What are you bad at? Ruth winced slightly, but Jesse didn't seem to take offense. Cooking, he said, and patience sometimes. Nora nodded like this was useful data she was filing away. Mama's good at cooking, she said. I'm aware, Jesse said. Ruth looked down at the wire, spool in her hands, and kept walking. The thing about a house that has been lived in alone for 3 years is that it shows the shape of that loneliness in specific practical ways. Not sentimental ways. Jesse was not a sentimental man. Or if he was, he'd packed it somewhere Ruth couldn't see. But in the way the kitchen had only ever one plate set out by habit, and the lamp in the main room was always positioned for one person's reading angle. And the firewood was always stacked in exactly the quantity one person needed. Small calibrations for a life that had narrowed to fit around one set of needs. Ruth changed these things gradually, the way you change anything that has been settled, into, carefully, at the margins first, giving the new arrangement time to become familiar before moving further in. She set 2 plates. She adjusted the lamp. She made food in quantities that served 4, which seemed obvious, but which also represented, every time she did it, a small insistence that 4 people existed here and had needs that were worth accounting for. Jesse noticed, she could tell, by the slight hesitations. The moment he came to the table and found 2 plates and recalibrated the glance at the lamp and then away. He didn't comment on any of it. She hadn't expected him to. What she hadn't expected was the second cot. She came in from the barn one afternoon in late January to find Jesse in the room off the kitchen, a pile of lumber on the floor and the sound of a handsaw working. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He was building a cot frame, simple, functional, the joints fitted with the precision of a man who knows joinery and doesn't feel the need to show off about it. You don't have to do that today, Ruth said. I know, he said, and kept sawing. Ruth stood there for a moment. The lumber, she said. Did you have it already, or? Went to town last week, he said, when you were here with the girls. She hadn't known he'd gone to town. He hadn't mentioned it. She thought about him making that trip in winter, specifically to acquire materials for a second cot, for a child who wasn't his, and she felt something in her chest that she was careful not to name. Thank you, she said. The girls shouldn't have to share all winter, he said, which was practical and true, and also entirely beside the point of what she was thanking him for. Emmy had not spoken. January moved through its weeks and February arrived, and Emmy remained in her silence, with a consistency that Ruth had stopped waiting against. The doctor had said in her own time, and Ruth had decided to take that literally, because the alternative was a kind of watching that tipped into pressure, and pressure was the last thing Emmy needed. But there were changes, small ones, visible only to someone paying close attention, which Ruth was. Emmy had stopped sitting near the walls. In those first days at the ranch, she had positioned herself in corners and against flat surfaces with the instinctive geography of a child who needs to know her back is protected. By mid-January, she was sitting in the middle of the room sometimes. Not always. Not comfortably, her back was still usually toward something solid, but in the middle. She had begun following Jesse at a distance, not the way Nora followed him. Purposeful and increasingly participatory, but the way certain animals follow a person they are evaluating, staying far enough back to have options, close enough to observe. Jesse appeared entirely untroubled by this. He moved through his days, and Emmy moved at the edges of them, and he neither encouraged it nor discouraged it, and Ruth thought that was probably the only right response, even if it had arrived through instinct rather than calculation. The wooden horse had become Emmy's constant. She carried it through the house, set it by her plate at meals, tucked it in with her at night. Jesse had seen her with it multiple times by now and had never once remarked on it, and Ruth thought, sure, he understands something about how fragile the thing is, even if he couldn't explain what he understands. The day Emmy put the horse on the kitchen table while Jesse was eating breakfast, set it deliberately between their plates, like an offering or a statement. Ruth happened to be at the stove with her back turned. She heard the small wooden sound of it being placed on the table, and she went very still without turning around. She heard Jesse stop chewing. A silence. Then Jesse said very quietly, "He's a good horse." Nothing. No response. Ruth held herself motionless at the stove. Then the sound of Emmy climbing down from her chair, which was unusual. She normally stayed at the table until everyone was done. Ruth heard small feet on the floorboards. Then nothing. Turned around. Jesse was looking down at the horse, which Emmy had left in the middle of the table. His expression was the one that appeared on his face. When he didn't know, it was visible, a kind of openness that he normally kept folded away somewhere practical and private. He looked up and caught Ruth watching. "She left it," he said. "See that," Ruth said. He looked back at the horse. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his fork and finished his breakfast, and the horse sat between them, and Ruth poured his coffee without being asked, the way she'd started doing without either of them, deciding she would. She told him about Silas on a Wednesday evening in the first week of February. Not because the moment was right. The moment was not right, would probably never be right, and she had been waiting for right long enough to understand that what she actually needed was simply to do it. She had been doing the calculation since she arrived how much to tell, in what order, with what framing, and she had finally arrived at the conclusion that there was only one honest version of this, and any other version was a form of continued dishonesty that she had already decided she was done with. The girls were in bed. The fire was low and going lower, the kind of fire you don't bother building up because the night is almost done. Jesse was at the table with the ranch ledger. The way he spent some evenings working through numbers with the focused grimness of a man who finds the math difficult but considers accuracy non-negotiable. Ruth sat across from him with her hands around a cup of cold coffee, and she said, "There's something I need to tell you." Put down his pencil and looked at her. She told him about Silas, all of it, in the order it had happened, Calvin's death, the room on Merchant Street, the decision to move into Silas's house, the year of slow compression, things Silas had said, the things Silas had done, the evening in October with Emmy in the back parlor which she described precisely and without softening it, because she had decided that if Jesse was going to understand the situation he was now part of, he deserved the unmodified version. She told him about the conversation at the kitchen table, about Reverend Alderman, about Silas explaining her future to her in the third person. She told him about the coin purse and the back door and the 4 in the morning and the stagecoach office at 6. Jesse listened to all of it without interrupting. His expression did not change in the ways she had been half expecting. He didn't get red-faced, didn't grip the table, didn't make the sounds of masculine outrage that some men made when presented with this kind of story. Sounds that were about their own feelings rather than the person telling it. He simply listened, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and she could tell by the stillness of him that he was taking it in rather than performing a reaction to it. When she was done, he said, "He knows where you are." "He doesn't know yet," Ruth said, "but he will find out. Silas is methodical. He doesn't give up on things he considers his. He considers you his. He considers the girls his," Ruth said. "I'm incidental to that." Jesse's jaw moved. What does he want with them? Ruth had thought about how to answer this question. She had thought about it many times, in the dark, in the cold, on the long walks between the house and the barn and back. The honest answer was complicated. Silas wanted the girls the way he wanted most things, not out of love but out of the particular need. Some men had to possess things that confirmed their own importance. The girls were Calvin's daughters, and Calvin was gone, and in Silas's accounting that made them a form of inheritance, something owed to him by the natural order of family obligation, regardless of what Ruth or anyone else had to say about it. Control, she said, that's what he wants. Over them, and through them, over me. Jesse was quiet for a long moment. The fire clicked softly in the hearth. "You should have told me this before you came," he said. "Yes," Ruth said. "I should have told you a number of things before I came." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not saying it would have changed the answer. I'm saying you should have told me." Ruth held his gaze. "I know." Another silence. The ledger sat open between them, forgotten. "When he comes," Jesse said, "not if." Ruth noticed. "When what does he plan to do?" "He'll try the law first," Ruth said. "He knows people. He has money, and he uses it carefully. He'll find a way to make a legal claim abandonment, probably, or unfit circumstances. He'll say the girls are suffering, that I'm incapable of providing for them, that he was their guardian and I removed them without consent. Can he make that stick?" "I don't know," Ruth said, which was the honest answer. "It depends on who's listening." Jesse picked up his pencil and set it back down without doing anything with it. "You're not married," he said. "No. An unmarried woman alone on a ranch, living with a man she's not married to." He said it without judgment, but with the particular flatness of a man reading a situation accurately. "That's not going to help you in a courtroom." Ruth said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Jesse looked at the ledger. He looked at the fire. He looked at the closed door to the room, where the girls were sleeping behind their separate cots. The second one finished 2 weeks ago, solid and level, made from lumber he'd driven to town to get in January. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as practical, not as anything else." Ruth waited. Getting married would complicate his claim considerably, Jesse said, legally. A woman with a husband on her own land, with the ranch showing income and the children in stable conditions, that's a different argument for a judge to work through than an unmarried woman living on someone else's property. Ruth sat very still. "I'm not saying it would be simple," he said. "I'm not saying it would fix everything. I'm saying it would change the ground you're standing on." Ruth looked at him across the table. Jesse Hawkins, who had received a desperate woman and 2 children he hadn't agreed to and had fed them anyway, built a cot anyway, fixed a fence anyway, said instead of when she told him Silas was coming. "You'd be taking on a considerable amount of trouble," Ruth said. "I already have," Jesse said. "More than this," she said. "Legal trouble. A man with money who holds grudges." "I'm aware, Jesse." "I heard you the first time," he said. Ruth set her cold coffee cup down carefully. "You've known me 6 weeks." "I know," he said. "And I know you rewrapped a horse's leg correctly, first try, and fixed a root cellar that was 3 weeks from losing the winter stores, and held fence posts in frozen ground without complaining. And you feed this household every day without making it a transaction." He paused. I also know what you did to get those girls here, and I know why you did it. He looked at her directly. That's not nothing. Ruth said nothing for a moment. It's not romantic, he said. I'm not saying it's that. I know what you're saying, Ruth said quietly. Is it something you'd consider? Ruth thought about Silas at the kitchen table, explaining her future to her. She thought about Emmy with the wooden horse, and Nora matching her stride to Jesse's across the snow. She thought about 4 a.m, and the back door, and the stagecoach at 6, and the letter she had written at a kitchen table in another man's house, trying to find a door. Yes, she said. I'd consider it. Jesse nodded once, picked up his pencil, and looked at the ledger. I'll ride to town next week and speak to the county clerk, he said. Ruth picked up her cup. All right, she said. They sat there in the fading firelight, two practical people in an impractical situation, and the wind came up outside, and the house held against it the way it had been holding all winter, steady and unremarkable and sufficient. The wedding was a plain thing, and neither of them expected it to be otherwise. The county clerk in Millard Creek performed it on a Thursday afternoon, with 2 ranch hands from the neighboring property as witnesses. Men Jesse had known for years, who shook his hand afterward with the careful nourishment of Quechuli's people whose they have decided not to ask. Ruth wore the better of her 2 dresses. Jesse wore a clean shirt. Nora stood very straight through the whole proceeding, and afterward asked the clerk if this meant she and Emmy could stay at the ranch forever. And the clerk looked at Jesse, and then at Ruth, and then back at Nora, and said he believed that was the general idea. Emmy had stayed at the ranch with a neighbor's wife, a woman named Della Marsh, who ran the property 2 miles east, and who had appeared at the door one morning with a jar of preserved peaches and the frank, measuring gaze of a woman doing reconnaissance. She had looked at Ruth and the girls and the visible state of the ranch, and apparently reached some conclusion, because she had come back twice since, with no particular reason given, and on the morning of the trip to town, she had simply shown up and announced she would sit with Emmy, leaving no real room to decline. When they returned, Emmy was at the kitchen table with Della Marsh, and there were biscuits cooling on the counter, different from Ruth's, smaller and rounder, and Emmy was holding the wooden horse in one hand and a piece of cornbread in the other. And she looked up when they came through the door with an expression that was, for the first time in months, closest to something Ruth recognized as ordinary. Della Marsh looked at Ruth's face when she came in and apparently read it correctly. She got her coat without ceremony and said she'd be back Thursday to help with the wash, and she said it in a tone that suggested this was not optional, and she left. Jesse hung his coat on the hook. He looked at Emmy. Emmy looked at him. We brought sugar candy, Nora announced, producing a small paper packet from her coat pocket with the satisfaction of someone who has been entrusted with something important. Jesse let me carry it. Emmy's eyes went to the packet. Jesse said, I figured we ought to mark the occasion. Ruth stood in the doorway of her house. The word arrived in her mind, without fanfare, without ceremony, just as the accurate word, and watched Jesse Hawkins distribute sugar candy to her daughters at the kitchen table. Not perfectly. He gave Nora too much and had to redistribute when Emmy's face made the injustice plain, and he did this with the slightly awkward deliberateness of a man learning a new set of social calculations. Nora negotiated loudly for what she considered her fair share. Emmy held her piece of candy and the wooden horse in the same hand and watched Nora with what might, if you were paying close attention, have been the beginning of amusement. Ruth came in and hung up her coat and put water on to heat. The ranch in February was brutal and unglamorous, and the days were long and cold, and there was always something that needed doing before the next thing that needed doing. Jesse was not an easy man to share space with. He was quiet in ways that were sometimes comfortable and sometimes opaque, and he had opinions about how certain tasks ought to be done that conflicted with Ruth's opinions. And they had 4 real arguments in the back half of February that left both of them silent and tight-jawed for periods ranging from 2 hours to most of a day. Ruth was not easy either. She was used to operating by her own judgment, and she didn't always remember to account for the fact that this was not fully her ranch yet, that There were systems here that had been built over years without her, that Jesse's way of doing something was not wrong, simply because it was different from hers. They managed. Not smoothly, but they managed, which is actually the relevant thing. The letter came on the 1st of March. It came with the regular post, which was delivered by the boy from town who made the rounds every 2 weeks or so in decent weather. Ruth was outside with Nora, checking the east fence when Jesse came out of the house with the letter in his hand and a look on his face that told her what it was before she could read it. She opened it there, standing in the yard with the cold coming in from the north. It was from Silas. Not long Silas had never wasted words when economy served him better. He wrote that he was aware of her location. He wrote that he was disappointed in her choices and had been willing to be forgiving, but that her continued absence and her removal of his brother's children from his care had compelled him to seek legal remedy. He wrote that he had spoken with an attorney in Cheyenne who believed there was a viable claim of wrongful removal of minor children and that he intended to pursue it. He did not write anything directly threatening. He didn't need to. Silas had always understood that the most effective threats were the ones that wore the clothing of reason. Ruth read the letter twice. Then she handed it to Jesse. He read it once. His face did the thing it did when he was processing. Something difficult went very still, the muscles in his jaw working slightly, his eyes moving through the words with the slow deliberateness of a man, making sure he understands exactly what he is dealing with. He handed it back. "He's coming," Jesse said. "Yes," Ruth said. Nora was standing 6 feet away, and Ruth could tell by the set of her shoulders that she had heard. Nora did not ask what the letter said. She looked at Jesse, and then at Ruth, and then she turned back to the fence post she'd been examining and put her hand on it and pressed, testing its solidity. "This one's loose," Nora said. "We need to reset it." Jesse looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face that was not simple. "After lunch," he said. Nora nodded. "Okay," she said. Ruth folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and looked out at the fence line running north, and she thought about Silas in Cheyenne with his attorney, building his case on paper, arranging his evidence with the patient architecture of a man who believes he has already won because he has always won. She thought about what Silas didn't know, that the root cellar was sealed and the horse was healed and the fence was being reset post by post, that there were 2 cots in the room off the kitchen and a neighbor named Della Marsh who showed up without being asked and distributed preserved peaches and unsolicited opinions, that there was a piece of paper in the county clerk's office in Millard Creek with her name on it and Jesse's name on it and a date in February, that Emmy had left the wooden horse on Jesse's side of the breakfast table that morning, the first time she had placed it anywhere other than her own space, and Jesse had moved his coffee cup to avoid knocking it over, without comment, as if this were simply the natural order of the table. Silas was building his case on what he knew. Ruth was standing on different ground than Silas knew about, and the question was whether it would be enough. She took her hand out of her pocket and went to help Nora with the fence post. The letter sat in Ruth's coat pocket for 3 days before she stopped reaching for it. She had read it enough times to have it memorized, which was not something she had intended, but which had happened anyway. The way certain things lodge in the mind, not because you want them there, but because the weight of them demands repetition. Silas's handwriting was precise and even. The handwriting of a man who considered penmanship a form of character, who believed that how you presented a thing was inseparable from the thing itself. The words were moderate and the tone was almost regretful, which was the most dangerous version of Silas. Silas performing reasonableness. Silas as the wronged party. Silas, who had only ever wanted what was best for those children and had been repaid with theft and abandonment. She knew that version of him. She had lived inside it for a year. Jesse's had said little about the letter after that first day. He had gone to town the following week, and Ruth had not asked what for, and when he came back he had mentioned briefly that he'd spoken to a man named Aldous Crane, who handled legal matters in the county, and that Crane had agreed to review their situation. That was all he said. Ruth had not pushed for more, partly because she was still learning the shape of Jesse's process, he thought, before he spoke, which she had learned to read as consideration rather than withholding, and partly because she needed to sit with the situation herself before she could talk about it productively. She had her own thinking to do. The thing Silas had correctly understood and was counting on was that Ruth had very little. That had been true when she left Merchant Street, and it was still technically true in the ways that courts tended to measure these things. She had no property of her own. The ranch was Jesse's. The marriage was 6 weeks old. A good attorney, and Silas would have a good attorney, would position all of this as a woman of unstable circumstance who had made a series of impulsive decisions while under stress, dragging 2 children through a blizzard into the home of a man she barely knew, who she had then hastily married, for reasons that were less about love and more about legal cover. All of that was technically accurate. The question was whether accuracy was the same as truth, and whether a judge in Laramie County in the winter of a difficult year would be able to see the Della Marsh arrived on a Thursday morning in early March, as she had announced she would, for the wash. She came with opinions about the condition of the boiling pot and the state of the lye soap and the placement of the wash line relative to the wind direction, and Ruth accepted all of these opinions with the equanimity she had developed toward Della over the past weeks, which was the equanimity of a person who has recognized that the other person is usually right and is sometimes insufferable about it, and that these two things coexist in a lot of genuinely valuable people. While they were working, Ruth told her about the letter. Della did not react with alarm or sympathy, or any of the responses Ruth had half expected. She listened to the whole thing, with her hands still moving in the wash water, and when Ruth was done, Della said, "What does this man look like?" Ruth blinked. "What? Silas Greer. What does he look like? I want to know him when I see him." Ruth described Silas, the particular combination of physical solidity and careful grooming that characterized him, the way he wore his clothing with an intention to it, the fact that he was not a large man, but took up a large man's worth of space in a room through the application of deliberate presence. Della absorbed this, and the attorney he's hired. "Do you know which one?" He mentioned a man in Cheyenne. "I don't have a name." Della's jaw moved. "I have a cousin in Cheyenne," she said. "Her husband works with the county records office. There are maybe 4 or 5 attorneys who take this kind of case on retainer for men of means." She wrung out a shirt with a force that suggested she was thinking of Silas's neck. "I'll write her today." Ruth looked at Della across the wash basin. "You don't have to?" "I know I don't have to," Della said, in the tone of someone who has dispensed with that particular category of objection permanently. "I'm going to." This was how Ruth learned, incrementally, that she had something Silas had not factored into his calculation: the specific network of women who inhabited a rural community, who knew everyone and were known by everyone, carried information in both directions, and kept track of everything, who showed up with preserved peaches and stayed for the wash and wrote letters to cousins in Cheyenne. Silas had been building his case on what he knew about Ruth's position. He did not know Della Marsh. He did not know the 2 ranch hands who had witnessed the wedding and who had, it turned out, been telling the story of it at every opportunity since, not because it was romantic, but because men who have lived alone a long time on the frontier develop a proprietary interest in the welfare of neighbors, who have likewise struggled, and Jesse Hawkins had been their neighbor for 11 years. He did not know the county clerk, who had noted in his record the unusual efficiency and lack of ceremony with which the marriage had been conducted, and who had formed his own quiet opinion about the reasons for it, and who had been discussing those reasons with his wife, who knew Della Marsh. Silas had looked at Ruth's position and seen isolation. What he had not seen, what he had never bothered to look for. Because men like Silas did not believe that the informal structures of working communities had legal weight, was that Ruth had spent 3 months becoming a member of something. She had not set out to do it. She had set out to survive, which is different. But survival in a place like this was not a solitary project And in the process of asking for what she needed and giving what she had accumulated a context that Silas's attorneys in Cheyenne did not know existed. It would matter. Whether it would matter enough, that was the part she couldn't calculate yet. Silas arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of March, which announced itself the way all difficult things announce themselves in hindsight, with a morning that felt ordinary. Ruth had been to the barn and back, and had bread in the oven, and was thinking about the south pasture drainage issue that she and Jesse had been arguing about. For 10 days, she thought the solution required regrading. He thought it required a channel ditch, and they were both right in ways that didn't add up to a unified approach. When she heard the sound of a horse and wagon coming up the road, she went to the window. She recognized Silas before she could make out his face, the same way you recognize certain things in peripheral vision, not by detail, but by quality. The specific combination of posture and intention that the body reads before the mind processes it. He was in a good wagon, 2 horses, and there was another man beside him she didn't know, better dressed than a working man, which would be the attorney. Her hands went still on the windowsill. She stood there for exactly the amount of time it took to decide she was not going to stand at the window while Silas came to her door. Then she went to the bedroom and told Jesse, who was already pulling on his boots, because he had heard the wagon too. "The girls," he said. "Nora's in the barn," Ruth said. "Emmy's in the back room." "Keep Emmy in the back room," he said. "Please," he said, not in order, a request. He looked at her briefly, and she saw in his face the thing she had come to recognize as his form of protectiveness, not dramatic, not loud, just a solid prepositioning of himself between the thing he cared about and whatever was coming. She went and told Emmy she needed to stay in the back room and play quietly for a while. Emmy looked at her with the measuring look, and Ruth met it evenly. Emmy picked up the wooden horse and went to her cot and sat cross-legged in the middle of it, and Ruth pulled the door most of the way closed. Jesse was already on the porch when the wagon stopped. Silas climbed down with the ease of a man who is comfortable arriving places uninvited because he has trained himself to believe that his arrival is always appropriate. He was dressed well, not ostentatiously, but with the deliberate correctness of a man who understands that appearance that constitutes evidence. He looked at Jesse with the specific look that men like Silas deploy at men they are assessing, comprehensive, fast, and designed to show that the assessment is happening. The other man climbed down more carefully, a leather bag over his shoulder. Ruth came out onto the porch and stood beside Jesse. Silas looked at her. His expression shifted through several things, quickly surprise, which he managed, and something underneath surprise that was not quite anger and not quite relief, and was in fact the expression of a man who finds that the situation has rearranged itself since he last looked at it. "Ruth," he said. "Silas," she said. A pause. His eyes moved over her, the state of her, the coat she was wearing, the fact that she was standing on a porch that was not collapsing, beside a man who had not stepped back when Silas has arrived. "You look well," he said, which was not a compliment. It was an observation with disappointment in it. "I am well," Ruth said. Silas looked at Jesse. "Jesse Hawkins, I assume." "That's right," Jesse said. He did not offer his hand. Silas did not appear to notice this, or appeared to decide not to appear to notice it, which amounted to the same thing. "My name is Silas Greer. I'm the brother of Ruth's late husband. I believe she's communicated to you the nature of my concern." "She has," Jesse said. "Then you understand why I'm here." "I understand what you think you're here for," Jesse said. "Whether it matches what you're actually going to accomplish is something we'll see." Silas's composure held, which Ruth had known it would. He had very good composure. It was one of the things that made him difficult. He didn't lose himself in confrontation, which meant you couldn't count on him making errors from heat. The attorney introduced himself as Franklin Price, from Cheyenne. He was moderate in every visible way, moderate height, moderate expression, the practiced neutrality of a man who has learned that emotion is a liability in his profession. He had a soft voice and a direct manner, and Ruth did not underestimate him, because nothing about him gave her the impression he could be underestimated safely. Mr. Hawkins, Price said. Mrs. Hawkins, I appreciate you receiving us. I want to be clear that Mr. Greer's intention here is not adversarial. He has legitimate concerns about the welfare of his late brother's children, and we're here to discuss a resolution that serves everyone's interests. The children are doing well, Jesse said. The ranch is in good order, the household is stable, and they have 2 parents providing for them. That seems like a resolution. Price nodded in the measured way of a man who has heard this kind of response before. Mr. Greer was the children's primary caretaker. For over a year, he said. He has an established relationship with them, and we would argue, a legal responsibility that predates Mrs. Hawkins's current arrangement. She's Mrs. Hawkins now, Jesse said. That's not an arrangement. That's a marriage. A recent one, Price said. Still counts, Jesse said. Silas had been letting his attorney handle the opening, the way experienced men let their tools work before applying their own hand. Now he stepped forward slightly. Ruth, he said, with the tone he used when he wanted to appear to be speaking only to her, cutting Jesse out of the conversation while he was still standing in it. I know you were frightened when you left. I understand that. I'm not here to make things difficult. I'm here because those girls are my family, and I believe they deserve stability and proper circumstances, and I want to make sure they have it. Ruth looked at him. She had thought, over the months, about what she would say when this moment arrived. She had composed versions of it in the dark, revised them, discarded them. What she said now was not any of those versions. You told Reverend Alderman you were going to marry me, she said. You didn't ask me. You told him. And then you sat me at the kitchen table and explained what my future was going to look like. You used the words "our girls" to every neighbor on Merchant Street for 4 months before I left. You did all of that. She paused. Don't tell me you were concerned for the children. You were concerned with ownership, and those are not the same thing. Silas' composure did not break, but something behind it shifted a slight repositioning, like a man on uncertain ground redistributing his weight. Price said smoothly, perhaps we could continue this conversation inside. Jesse looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Jesse, a beat one of the small communications that had been developing between them over months of close proximity, the kind that doesn't need words. Fine, Jesse said. He held the door. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ruth made biscuits every morning, where Emmy had left the wooden horse, where Jesse worked the ledger on winter evenings. Silas sat across from Ruth, with the table between them and the attorney beside him, with a leather bag open, and Jesse sat at the head of the table with his arms on the surface and his hands together, and Ruth thought, he looks like a man who is completely at home, because he is. Price laid out the legal argument with precision and without drama. Wrongful removal of minors from established guardianship, instability of current environment. He cited the recent marriage, the brevity of the acquaintance preceding it, the circumstances of the children's arrival. He cited the blizzard, which Ruth found almost admirable in its audacity, the very thing that had demonstrated her willingness to risk herself for her children being reframed as evidence of her poor judgment. Jesse's listened to all of it, then he said, You want to talk about stability? I've had this ranch for 11 years. I know every acre of it. We have cattle, horses, livestock, full root cellar, a working household. The children have their own sleeping arrangements. They eat well. They work alongside their parents every day. He paused. The older girl is learning fence work. The younger one, she's been through something hard, and she's getting better. Slower than we'd like, but better. Taking them out of here wouldn't help that. It would do the opposite. The younger child's condition, Price said carefully, could be seen as evidence that her current circumstances have not adequately addressed her needs. The room went very quiet. Jesse's hands, which had been together on the table, separated slightly. Ruth felt the quality of his stillness change in a way she had learned to read, not anger, not yet, but the state just before it, when a man who has been patient has reached the edge of his patience and is deciding what to do with it. Condition, Jesse said, was caused by a man in whose house she was living before Ruth brought her here. You want to be careful about how you use it as an argument because it points in a direction that isn't favorable to your client. Price looked at Silas. Something moved between them fast, communicative, the look of two men who have prepared for a line of discussion they hoped would not be raised. Silas has said, "That's an accusation." "I didn't accuse anyone of anything specific," Jesse said. I said, "Her condition was caused by circumstances before she came here." Ruth said the same thing when she told me about leaving your house. I'm just noting that if you want to put the child's well-being at the center of this, you ought to think carefully about where that line of inquiry leads. Price cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could focus on the formal." "I'd like to know," Jesse said, "what exactly your client is seeking. Not in legal language, in plain terms." Price looked at Silas. Silas looked at Ruth. Then Silas said, "I want to be part of those children's lives. I want assurance that they're being properly provided for. And I believe I have a right, as their father's brother, to have some say in their upbringing." "You don't," Jesse said. "Not legally and not practically. They have a mother and a stepfather and a home. That's what the law recognizes. The law also recognizes established guardianship, which was not a formal arrangement," Jesse said. "Ruth moved into your house as a guest under difficult circumstances. There was no legal guardianship established, no document filed, nothing recorded with any county. She left. She came here. She married me. And the children are in a stable two-parent household on a working ranch. That's what any judge in this territory is going to see." Price was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Jesse with the particular look of an attorney who has realized that the other side of the table is not as straightforward as it appeared. "You've spoken with counsel," Price said. "I've spoken with Aldous Crane," Jesse said. Another small shift between Price and Silas. Aldous Crane was apparently a name that meant something. Silas leaned forward slightly. He addressed Ruth directly, cutting around Jesse again, but this time with less authority behind it. "Ruth, those are Calvin's daughters, my brother's children. You cannot expect me to simply step away from them." Ruth looked at him across the table. "Calvin is gone," she said. "And whatever Calvin was to you, whatever you owed each other, or thought you did, that doesn't transfer to his daughters. They are mine. They are not a debt." Silas's jaw tightened. It was the first real crack in his composure, and it was small, and he recovered it in about 2 seconds. But Ruth had been watching for it for months, and she saw it. "I have documentation," Price said, opening his bag. He produced papers, a letter from Reverend Alderman, which did not surprise Ruth, a statement from a neighbor on Merchant Street named Colm Haber, which did not surprise her either, because Colm Haber had always thought Silas was a fine man and told everyone so, and a doctor's statement about Emmy's condition, obtained from the doctor in Casper. Jesse picked up the doctor's statement and read it carefully. Then he set it down. "This says she's not talking," he said. "It doesn't say why." The doctor's assessment. "The doctor saw her once," Jesse said, "for about 20 minutes. What he knows is what Ruth told him, which is what Ruth knew at the time." He looked at Price steadily. "We know more now." Price looked at him. "What do you know now?" Jesse said nothing for a moment. Ruth felt the calculation he was running, how much to say, what to put into a room with Silas present, what could be turned against them. "Enough," Jesse said, "that if this goes to a judge, I'd want the question asked openly. What happened in that house in October that frightened a child into silence? I'd want it. Asked in front of people who knew Silas Greer and his household, and I'd want the answers on record." The room was very quiet. Silas said, carefully, "Nothing happened in that house." "Then you shouldn't have anything to worry about," Jesse said. Price put his papers back into his bag. He did it methodically, without hurry, but he did it. The knock at the back door came. At that moment, the back door, which opened off the kitchen, which meant it was someone who knew the house well enough not to come to the front. Jesse said, "Come in," and Della Marsh opened the door. She stood in the doorway, in her coat, with a covered dish in her hands, and looked at this assembled company at the kitchen table, with the expression of a woman who has walked into exactly the scene she expected to walk into. "Brought the potato soup," she said to Ruth. Figured you'd have a full house today. Ruth looked at her. Della set the dish on the counter and turned around and looked at Silas Greer with the comprehensive, flat evaluation of a woman who has been briefed. You must be the brother-in-law, Della said. She did not make it sound like a pleasant thing to be. Silas looked at her. And you are? Della Marsh. My property borders this one to the east. I've known Jesse Hawkins since before his wife died, and I've known Ruth since she arrived here, and those girls have been eating at my table since February. She crossed her arms. If someone's asking whether those children are being looked after, I'll tell them directly. Price looked at Della with the professional attention of a man recalibrating a situation. Mrs. Marshnuch, we're not questioning. I know what you're doing, Della said, and I know who paid for the train ticket from Cheyenne. She looked at Silas with the flatness of someone who has done her research. Your attorney worked 3 cases in this territory in the last 2 years. Lost 2 of them. The one he won was against a woman who had no neighbors willing to speak for her. She paused. Ruth has neighbors. The kitchen was very quiet. Price cleared his throat again. He looked at Silas with the look of an attorney delivering a non-verbal assessment. Silas received it with the stillness of a man re-examining his options. Mr. Greer, Price said, moderately, perhaps we might discuss the matter privately before proceeding further. Silas looked at Ruth. Then he looked at Jesse. Then he looked at Della Marsh, who looked back at him with absolute equanimity, and there was something in Della's face that Ruth recognized the particular confidence of a woman who knows the precise number of people who will stand up and say what they know if asked. Silas stood up. He buttoned his coat. He looked at Ruth one more time, and this time she saw, underneath the composure and the architecture of his position, the specific look of a man who has understood that the terrain he had mapped does not match the terrain he is standing in. He said, I'll be in contact through my attorney. Jesse stood as well. That's fine, he said. Crane will respond. They walked Silas and Price to the door. Jesse stood in the doorway and watched them cross the yard and climb into the wagon, and Ruth stood slightly behind him and watched too. Silas did not look back. He gathered the reins and turned the wagon without haste, and then the wagon went down the road and became small, and then disappeared into the flat distance of the marsh landscape. Jesse stayed in the doorway a moment longer after the wagon was gone. Ruth could see the line of his shoulders, the slight forward lean of a man standing down from something. Then he stepped back and closed the door. Della was already at the stove, moving the soup pot to the right burner, taking stock of what else needed doing with the efficient survey of a woman who manages multiple properties simultaneously. That went better than it could have, Della said. It's not over, Ruth said. No, Della agreed. But he knows now what he's walking into. Men like that do their math. She found a ladle and tasted the soup and made a face that suggested it had held up adequately on the ride over. It changes the calculation. Jesse had gone to the back room. Ruth heard the door open softly, heard the murmur of his voice too low to make out words, and then nothing. She went down the short hallway and stood in the doorway. Jesse was sitting on the edge of Emmy's cot. Emmy was sitting cross-legged in the middle of it, the wooden horse in her hands. Looking at him with the careful, direct attention she gave everything she was deciding about. He wasn't saying anything now. He had apparently said what he needed to say. Whatever it was, and now he was just sitting there in the way he sat near animals that needed to understand he meant them no harm still, unhurried, giving the other creature all the time it required. Emmy looked at him for a long moment. Then she moved forward slightly on the cot and leaned not fully, not all the way, but the first inch of it, her small shoulder just touching the outside of his arm. Jesse didn't move. His hands stayed where they were. He looked at the wall across the room and breathed. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched her daughter make the smallest and largest decision she had made in months. Nora appeared at Ruth's elbow, having come in from the barn at some point, without Ruth noticing smelling of hay and cold air. She looked into the room at her sister and Jesse, and then looked up at Ruth with the evaluating eyes she used when she was putting a complicated picture together. Is he going to come back? She asked. She didn't need to specify who. Probably, Ruth said honestly. Nora looked back into the room. Jesse won't let him take us. Ruth looked at her daughter. The certainty in her voice, not childish certainty, not the easy faith of a child who hasn't yet learned that the world doesn't guarantee outcomes, but something harder earned than that. Something that had been built over months of watching a man show up every morning and do the same for the same reasons. Something. No, Ruth said. He won't. From the kitchen, Della called that the soup was hot and she wasn't keeping it warm all day. Ruth put her hand briefly on Nora's shoulder. Nora went to the kitchen. Ruth looked once more at Jesse and Emmy on the cot, the small figure leaning its fraction of an inch against the large, still one. And then she went to set the table for 4. Della's soup was good, which was the kind of detail that stays with you long after the dramatic things fade. Ruth remembered that clearly, sitting at the table in the aftermath of Silas's visit, the wagon gone, and the door closed, and the particular silence of a house that has just been tested and held, eating potato soup out of a shared pot, while Della held forth about the drainage situation on her east pasture, which she had solved 3 years ago with a method she was willing to describe in detail if anyone was interested. Jesse was interested, or at least asked the right questions, and Nora asked 2 questions of her own that were actually relevant, and Emmy sat with her soup and her wooden horse and was present in the specific quiet way she had that was different from absence. It was an ordinary meal in the middle of an unordinary day, and Ruth sat inside it and thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not resolved, but present and full, and with people in it. The letter from Price arrived 11 days later. It was shorter than she expected and more formal than the previous communication from Silas, which told her something about how the dynamic between attorney and client had shifted since the visit to the ranch. Price wrote that Mr. Greer wished to pursue the matter through the proper legal channels, and that a hearing had been requested before Judge Clement Harrow of Laramie County, to be scheduled at the court's earliest convenience. He wrote that the hearing would address the question of guardianship of Nora Callaway, age 7, and Emmy Callaway, age 4, and that both parties would be expected to present evidence of their capacity and fitness to provide for the children's well-being. Ruth read it once. Then she gave it to Jesse, who read it and gave it to Aldous Crane, who came out to the ranch 2 days later and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his own set of papers and explained what they were dealing with. Crane was a dry, precise man of about 50, with the kind of face that revealed nothing on purpose, and the kind of mind that had clearly spent decades in rooms where the difference between what was said and what was meant was the entire game. He had gray at his temples and ink stains on his right hand, and he listened more than he talked, which Ruth took as a good sign. He explained that Judge Harrow was not a man given to sentimentality, which was actually in their favor. A judge who had decided on sentiment might be moved by Silas's performance of grief and family obligation, while a judge who decided on evidence would have to work with what was actually in front of him. He explained that their strongest position was the stability of the current household, the marriage, the ranch, the documented income, the community standing, and that their most significant vulnerability was the brevity of it. 6 weeks of marriage and 3 months of residence was not a long history. What about Emmy? Ruth asked. Crane looked at her. What about her specifically? They'll use her condition as evidence that the current situation is inadequate. They'll try, Crane said. Our response to that is to establish the timeline of when the condition began and under what circumstances. If we can demonstrate through testimony, through witness account that the child was already in this state when she arrived at the ranch, that undercuts the argument that the current environment is the cause. He paused. It also raises questions about the prior environment. Jesse looked at Crane steadily. We're not going to use Emmy as a weapon. No, Crane said, but we can use the facts. The facts are not the same as the child. Ruth thought about the difference between those two things for a long time after Crane left. The facts were not the same as Emmy. The facts were a child who had stopped speaking in October, while living in her uncle's house. A child who was brought to a ranch in December and had, in 3 months, moved her chair closer to the table and left a wooden horse on a grown man's pillow and leaned the first inch of herself against an almost stranger's arm. The facts were forward-moving. The facts actually helped. It was the telling of them that she dreaded. Putting Emmy in the center of a room full of legal argument, even by proxy, even through testimony with Emmy herself nowhere present, felt like a violation of something she had been trying to protect since October. The whole careful architecture of letting Emmy come back to herself at her own pace, the not asking, the not pushing, the accepting of each small movement as sufficient seemed incompatible with a courtroom that would require the condition to be named, categorized, explained, assigned cause. She said this to Jesse that night after the girls were in bed. He listened. He did not immediately respond, which she had learned was not indifference, but the opposite. He was taking it seriously enough to think before he answered. "You're right that it's a risk," he said, "but not doing it is also a risk. If we don't explain the timeline, they get to explain it their way." "I know," Ruth said, "and their way puts it here. On this house. On you, I know that too." Jesse was quiet. The fire was going low. "What does Emmy know?" he said. "About what's happening?" Ruth considered. "She knows Silas came. She saw the wagon. She was in the back room, but she understands more than she lets on. She always has." Jesse nodded slowly. Is there any way she can communicate what she knows? Without speaking? Ruth looked at him. It was not a question she had expected. "She nods," she said. "She has since she stopped talking." Small nods, shakes of the head. "If you ask directly." If someone asked her directly, Jesse said carefully, whether she was afraid in Silas's house, whether she wanted to go back, she could answer that. Ruth sat with that for a long moment. She could, she said. "But I know you don't want to put her in front of a courtroom," Jesse said. "I don't either. But Crane needs to know this is possible. What happens with it is his decision and yours, not mine." He said the last part plainly, without emphasis, and Ruth understood it. For what it was not a withdrawal from the decision, but a placement of the decision where he believed it belonged. Her. This was her daughter. He had been clear, consistently, and without making a performance of it, about which things were his to decide and which were hers. And she had not always appreciated the boundary, when it felt like distance, but she appreciated it now. "I'll tell Crane," she said. The hearing was set for the first week of April, which gave them 3 weeks. Ruth spent those weeks doing what she had always done when she was frightened. She worked. The south pasture drainage problem that she and Jesse had been disagreeing about got resolved in the 2nd week of March, when they stood in the mud looking at the problem long enough that the argument transformed, as arguments sometimes do when both people are stubborn enough and honest enough, into a third solution that neither had proposed. It required both the regrading she had wanted and the channel ditch Jesse had wanted, in a specific sequence that made each one more effective. They spent 2 days executing it, and it worked, and neither of them made much of being right, because they both were, and it didn't seem worth the energy. Nora helped with the drainage. She had become genuinely useful in ways that continued to catch Ruth slightly off guard, not because she was surprised by Nora's capability, but because capability at 7, real capability, always carries a weight to it that is bittersweet to witness. You want your children to be capable. You don't want to need them to be. Nora knew something was happening. Ruth had told her there was going to be a meeting with some people who would ask questions about the ranch and the family, and that she might need to answer some questions herself. And Nora had received this information with the steadiness that characterized all of her responses to difficult things. "Will I have to see him?" Nora asked. She did not say Silas's name, which was itself an answer about something. "Probably not," Ruth said. "But I want you to be honest if someone asks you questions. About the ranch, about the family, about what your life is like here." Nora looked at her. "I'll just tell the truth." "That's exactly right," Ruth said. "Truth is good," Nora said. with the simplicity of a child who has not yet fully learned how complicated that sentence is. And Ruth nodded and left it there. Emmy was the one Ruth watched most carefully in those 3 weeks. She watched for signs of regression, the wall, sitting, the heightened vigilance, the specific quality of attention that meant Emmy was tracking exits. Silas had come and gone, and Ruth did not know whether Emmy fully understood what that visit meant, but she knew Emmy had been aware of it. What she saw, instead of regression, was something she had not expected. Emmy started going to the barn in the mornings. Not with Nora, not following anyone in particular. She would simply appear at the barn door when Jesse was doing the morning work and stand there and after a while go in. Jesse had adapted to this the way he adapted to all of Emmy's movements without comment, without adjustment, simply incorporating her presence into whatever he was already doing. Ruth watched from the kitchen window one morning and saw Jesse carrying a bucket across the barn while Emmy walked beside him, her hand not quite touching his coat sleeve, hovering at a distance of perhaps 2 inches. The horse in the near stall put her head over the rail, and Emmy stopped walking, and Jesse stopped walking, and Emmy reached up and touched the horse's nose with 2 fingers. Jesse said something. Ruth couldn't hear it. Emmy did not respond verbally. Ruth had not expected that, but she kept her fingers on the horse's nose, and Jesse set the bucket down and waited. They'd stood there for what Ruth estimated was 2 full minutes, the man and the child and the horse in the cold morning light coming through the barn door, and nothing was required of any of them except presence. Ruth went back to the biscuits. Aldous Crane came out once more before the hearing to go over what he called the evidentiary structure of their case, which meant he sat at the kitchen table and told them what they were going to say and in what order and what they were not going to say under any circumstances. He was direct about their vulnerabilities, which Ruth appreciated. She had no use for reassurance that wasn't grounded in reality. And Crane seemed to understand this. Their vulnerabilities were the brevity of the marriage, the unusual circumstances of Ruth's arrival, the fact that she had taken money from Silas's household when she left. "He'll raise the money," Crane said. "Price will frame it as theft." "It wasn't theft," Ruth said. "It was wages owed." "I know what it was," Crane said. "The question is whether we can document it." Ruth had thought about this. She had kept a record, not because she had planned to end up in a courtroom, but because she had always kept records, a habit from her father's farm, where accounts were the difference between you stood and being surprised by it. She had an informal ledger she'd started 3 months into living in Silas's house, tracking work done and estimating its value against the room and board she was receiving. It was not a legal document, but it was specific and consistent, and in her handwriting, which meant it had been contemporaneous and not constructed afterward. She gave it to Crane. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "This is useful." "I didn't keep it for this," Ruth said. "I know," he said. "That's why it's useful." The day before the hearing, Jesse went to the barn after dinner and did not come back for an hour. Ruth gave him the hour without going to look for him, because she had learned the distinction between his needing space and his needing something, and this was the former. Again, this senior. When he came back in, he washed his hands at the basin and looked at her across the kitchen. "I'm going to tell them about my wife," he said. Ruth looked at him. "Margaret," he said. He said it carefully. "The way you say a word you don't say often, not like it hurt." "Exactly, but like it had weight. She died in childbirth 3 years ago. The child, too," he paused. "I haven't talked about it in a courtroom or anywhere else. Crane thinks it matters for the judge to understand why the house was empty before you came, and what kind of man I was in it." Ruth said, "Jesse, you don't—" "I know I don't," he said. "I'm going to anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had built a cot from lumber he drove to town to get in January. The man who left a rough wooden horse on the kitchen table without explanation. The man who said when instead of if, and sat still beside a small child until she moved 1 inch toward him. "Okay," she said. He nodded once. He went to bed. Ruth sat at the kitchen table alone for a while. She thought about Margaret, whom she had never known and never would. and about the shape that loss had left in this house, the one plate, the lamp angle, the firewood stacked for one. She thought about what it meant that Jesse was willing to carry that loss into a public room and set it down on a table for strangers to look at, because it served a purpose beyond himself. She thought, he is a good man, not a simple man, not an easy man, and she had not chosen him under circumstances that allowed for the leisurely evaluation of character. But the character had revealed itself anyway, in the daily accumulation of small decisions, and what it had revealed was someone who did not perform goodness, but simply practiced it, imperfectly and without fanfare, in the available situations. That was its own kind of answer to a question she had been carrying since December. The courthouse in Millard Creek was a 2-story wooden building that smelled of pine resin and old paper and the particular damp of a building that is heated inconsistently. Judge Clement Harrow was older than Ruth, had expected 70 or near it, with a white beard kept short, and the kind of eyes that had looked at a very large number of human problems and had reached some conclusions about them. He was not warm. He was also not cold. He was the kind of precise that comes from having made decisions with real consequences for a long time and having learned to take that seriously. Silas was already in the room when they arrived. He was sitting at a table across the central aisle with Price beside him, and he looked. Ruth noticed this with a kind of detached clarity, like a man who had made the mistake of believing too completely in his own narrative. He looked like he expected to win, and in Ruth's experience, that expectation often made people sloppy in the places that mattered. Nora was not in the courthouse. She was at Della Marsh's property, where she had gone the night before, and where Della had installed her in the kitchen, with a project involving the mending of several items that Della had specifically set aside for the purpose of giving Nora something to do with her hands. Emmy was there too. Ruth had not considered bringing Emmy anywhere near this proceeding. But Emmy had done something before Ruth left that morning. Ruth had been getting her coat on in the hallway when she heard small feet on the floorboards behind her. Turned around. Emmy was standing in the hall in her nightdress, holding the wooden horse with both hands. She looked at Ruth with the direct, measuring look she gave things she had decided about. Then she held the horse out. Ruth looked at it. "You want me to take it?" Emmy pressed it toward her. "Yes." Ruth took it. She held it for a moment, this rough little carved thing with its uneven legs, and suggested mane, worn smooth in the places Emmy's hands had held it most. She put it in her coat pocket. Emmy turned around and went back to the room she shared with Nora. Ruth stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the shape of the horse in her pocket. Then she went out to the wagon where Jesse was waiting. The hearing took most of the morning. Price was good. Ruth had known he would be good, and he was. He laid out Silas's position with clarity and without obvious manipulation, which was more effective than manipulation would have been. He described the year in Silas's household as a period of stability and care. He described Ruth's departure as impulsive, ill-considered, and harmful to the children. He described Emmy's silence as an ongoing medical concern that had not been adequately addressed. He described the marriage to Jesse as sudden, strategically motivated, and insufficiently established to constitute genuine family stability. All of it was accurate and none of it was true, and the difference between accurate and true was the entire thing. When Crane stood up, he did not argue with Price's account. He built a different picture. He started with the ledger Ruth's informal record of work and wages, which he entered as evidence of a woman who tracked her own labor with precision, who understood the economics of a household, who had not stolen but settled a debt she was owed, called the county clerk, who confirmed the date and circumstances of the marriage, and who described and asked, is not his impression of the two parties careful, practical, committed to establishing a legal household for the children already in their care, called one of the ranch hands, who had witnessed the wedding, a man named Burl Tasker, who was 50 years old and had known Jesse Hawkins since before Margaret died, and who said, in response to Crane's direct question, that he had never seen Jesse Hawkins take responsibility for something he didn't intend to follow through on, and that the man didn't do things for appearances. Then Crane called Jesse. Jesse testified without notes and without the kind of prepared fluency that sounds prepared. He described the ranch, its operation, its income. He described the morning Ruth arrived, what she had done, in what order, how she had functioned under the immediate crisis of Emmy's condition. He described the weeks that followed in the specific, practical terms of a working operation, what had been repaired, what had been built, what decisions had been made jointly, and what the outcomes had been. Described the girls, not sentimental, not vague, but accurate. Nora's capability and intelligence. Emmy's gradual movement back toward the world. Then Crane asked about Margaret. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Courtroom was quiet. He said what he had said he would say. He said it plainly, without performing the grief or defending himself against it. His wife had died 3 years ago. The child with her. The house had been a house for one person, since calibrated that way, shrunk to fit. He said he had not anticipated what it would mean to have people come into it, and that what it had meant was not what he had expected. He said the children were not a difficulty he was managing. Moke? He said they were people he had come to be responsible for in the way that responsibility sometimes arrives, not chosen exactly, not planned, but genuine. Judge Harrow looked at him for a long moment after he finished. You married Mrs. Hawkins after 6 weeks of acquaintance, Harrow said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Jesse said. That's a short time. It is, Jesse said. Why then and not later? Jesse looked at the judge steadily. Because there was a man with an attorney who was going to try to take her children, he said, and because she deserved to have someone in her corner before that happened, and because by that point I had seen enough to know she was the kind of person you want in your corner, too. He paused. Timing was practical. The decision wasn't only practical. Harrow looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at his papers. Ruth testified, after Jesse. She had been more afraid of this than she had admitted to anyone, including herself. She was afraid of Price's cross-examination, afraid of how the story sounded from the outside, the coin purse, the 4 a.m, the back door, the letter to a stranger. She was afraid of saying Silas's name in a room where he was sitting 15 feet away with his hands on the table. She sat in the chair in front of the judge's bench, and she thought about Emmy handing her the wooden horse. Told the truth. She told it in the order it happened, without strategic framing, without preemptive defense. The year in Silas's house, the conversation about Reverend Alderman, kitchen table, and the third person, the back parlor in October, and what she had found and what had happened after, the ledger and the coin purse, the 4 a.m, the stagecoach, and the blizzard and the knock on a door she could barely find in the dark. She told it without crying, which cost her something. When Price stood to cross-examine, he asked about the money first. She explained the ledger. He questioned the informality of it. She said that informal records are still records, that she had kept them in real time, that the amounts were accurate, and that she had taken less than she was owed because she was in a hurry, and not because she was uncertain of the calculation. He asked about Emmy's condition. He asked whether the child had received ongoing medical care. Ruth said yes. Della, Marsh's son-in-law, who was a physician in the next county, had examined Emmy in February and given his assessment. Crane had not mentioned this witness yet, and Price did not know about him, and the small pause in Price's examination told Ruth that he was adjusting. Mrs. Hawkins, Price said, wouldn't you agree that a child who cannot speak requires more specialized support than a working ranch can reasonably provide? Ruth looked at him. She thought about Emmy in the barn with 2 fingers on a horse's nose. She thought about the wooden horse on Jesse's side of the breakfast table. She thought about the first inch of a shoulder leaning against an arm. My daughter is not speaking yet, Ruth said, but she is communicating. She is present. She is moving toward the world, which is the direction she was not moving in your client's house. She paused. What my daughter needs is safety and patience and people who do not require anything from her before she is ready. What she has on that ranch is exactly that. What she had in Silas Greer's house was the opposite. Price started to respond. Judge Harrow held up one hand. "I've heard enough on that point," Harrow said. Silas testified last, which was Price's choice, and Ruth thought it was the wrong one. Silas was at his best when he was preparing the ground, and by the time he sat down to testify, the ground had been prepared by other people in ways he couldn't undo. He was still composed. He was still reasonable. He talked about Calvin, about his obligation to his brother's memory, about the children's welfare. He was not unconvincing, but he had to answer questions about October. Crane stood up and asked, directly and without preamble, to describe the incident in the back parlor. He asked what Emmy had been doing before Silas found her. He asked what game they had been playing. He asked where Ruth had been. He asked how long it had been before Ruth arrived. He asked each question separately, plainly, and Silas answered each one, separately and plainly, and the answers were not incriminating in any single moment, but in sequence they built a picture that Silas could not control, because the questions were arranged to follow the facts, and the facts had their own logic. By the last question, Silas's composure was intact, and his credibility was somewhere else. Harrow called a recess. Ruth sat in the hallway with Jesse and Crane and drank water from a tin cup and said nothing. Jesse sat beside her with his elbows on his knees and his hands together and also said nothing. Crane reviewed his papers with the focused efficiency of a man who has done what he could and is now doing the math on how it landed. When Harrow came back, he did not take long. He said that the question before him was not which party had greater affection for the children, or which party's claim to connection was longer established by blood or time, but which arrangement served the children's present and future welfare most adequately. He said that the evidence presented demonstrated a functioning household, a stable marital arrangement, a working operation with documented income, and multiple community witnesses attesting to the quality of care being provided. He said that the children had been through a significant disruption and that their current stability was not something to be lightly disturbed without compelling evidence that the current arrangement was harmful and that he had seen no such evidence. He said that Ruth Hawkins was the children's mother, that Jesse Hawkins had undertaken legal responsibility for the family, and that the court found no grounds to interfere with the current custodial arrangement. He said Silas Greer's petition was denied. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Crane put his papers back in his bag with the same methodical unhurry with which he always did everything. Ruth sat still. She had been braced for something. The relief was not what she had expected, which was large. It was quieter than large. It was the specific feeling of a weight you have been carrying so long that you stopped being aware of the full extent of it, and then it is gone. And you feel the absence before you feel anything else. Jesse put his hand over hers on the table. He did not say anything. She did not look at him. They sat like that for about 10 seconds, and then they got up and gathered their things and walked out. Silas was already gone by the time they reached the hallway. He had left quickly, which was out of character, and Ruth did not know whether that was Price's guidance or his own decision. And she found she did not particularly care. Outside, the April air was cold and clean. The sky the particular blue that follows a stretch of gray as if the color is making a point. Ruth stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it. Jesse came and stood beside her. "Della's going to want to hear all of it," he said. "Della probably already knows," Ruth said. "Probably," he agreed. They stood there for a moment. The town of Millard Creek moved around them, a wagon going past, 2 men talking in front of the hardware store, a dog crossing the road with the purposeful air of a dog that has somewhere to be. "You told them about Margaret?" Ruth said. "Yes," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "It was the truth," he said. "Felt like the truth ought to be in the room." Ruth nodded. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the wooden horse, its rough edges, the smoothed places, the uneven legs. 4 years old, and already this child had developed a sense for when something needed to be sent forward, given over, trusted to another person's keeping. Ruth did not know what Emmy understood about any of this, not precisely. But Emmy had put the horse in her hand that morning, and she had brought it through the hearing, and they were on the other side of it now. She took the horse out of her pocket and looked at it. Jesse looked at it too. "She made me take it this morning," Ruth said. Jesse was quiet for a moment. "She knew you needed something to hold on to," he said. Ruth looked at the horse in her palm. It was possible. Emmy had always understood more than she was given credit for. It was also possible that Emmy had simply wanted Ruth to have the horse, for reasons that were Emmy's and did not require translation. Either way, it had done what it was supposed to do. The drive back was long, and the road was muddy from the April thaw, which made it slow, and the wagon complained about two of the deeper ruts, in ways that Jesse navigated without comment. Ruth sat beside him on the box and watched the landscape change from the flat open stretch around town to the rolling country that surrounded the ranch. And she thought about what had just happened and what it meant. What it meant. Practically, Silas could appeal. But Crane thought he wouldn't, because an appeal required more money and more exposure, and the October questions would only become more detailed with further proceedings. What it meant in the larger sense was harder to articulate. She had spent 14 months in the aftermath of Calvin's death being managed, arranged, spoken for, positioned as a variable in someone else's calculation. And then she had walked through a door in a blizzard into a stranger's house and had spent 3 months becoming, through the ordinary accumulation of work and trust and difficulty, something different. She was not transformed. She was not healed in the way that stories sometimes resolve their protagonists. All of the damage addressed and all of the rough edges smooth. She still woke some nights at 3 in the morning, with Silas's voice in her head, patient and architectural, explaining her options. She still had arguments with Jesse that went unresolved for a day or two, before one of them found the angle that broke the deadlock. She was still, in many practical ways, learning how to be in this life she had constructed from necessity and luck and stubbornness. She had built it. That was the thing she kept coming back to, on the wagon in the April mud. She had looked at an advertisement in the back of a newspaper in a cold post office and done the calculation, and written a letter and posted it, and bought a stagecoach ticket and walked through a blizzard and knocked on a door. Every door after that, first one had required something similar, not luck, not rescue, but the willingness to keep moving toward the next available thing. She thought about what she would tell Emmy when Emmy had her words back. She would not tell her that the world was safe, because the world was not uniformly safe. And Emmy already knew that at 4 years old, and Ruth was not going to insult her intelligence by pretending otherwise. She would tell her that some doors are worth knocking on, that the people on the other side of them are sometimes nothing like you expected and better than you hoped, and that you will not know which until you. She would tell her that belonging is not something you are given. You build it the way you build anything imperfectly, with the materials available, over time, through the daily decision to keep building. They came through the gate at dusk. The lights were on in Della's house, visible across the east field, which meant the girls were still there, and dinner was probably happening. Jesse pulled the wagon up, and they got down, and he put the horses in the barn. And Ruth stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the house. It was not a beautiful house. It was a working house, worn in the ways that working things get worn. There was a board on the porch that still needed replacing. Kitchen window had a draft she had not fully solved. The root cellar was adequate, but she wanted to rebuild it properly in the fall, and she and Jesse had already had the preliminary argument about how. But the lamps were on inside, and she could see the glow of the fire through the front window, and when she pushed open the door, the house smelled of warmth, and the remnants of whatever Jesse had built in the hearth that morning before they left. She went in. She took her coat off. She put the wooden horse on the kitchen table where it lived Emmy's designated spot, for it the place it returned to at the end of each day like a small anchor. Jesse came in from the barn 20 minutes later and found her starting the stove. He washed his hands and poured water and sat at the table, and neither of them, said much because the day had used up a particular kind of language, and the quiet was all right. An hour later, they heard Della's wagon. The girls came in with the cold still on them. Nora first through the door with the specific energy of a child who has been patient all day and has reached the end of patience's useful life. She looked at Ruth and then at Jesse and she said, "Well, we won," Jesse said. Nora stood very still for about 2 seconds. Then she sat down in her chair at the table. Hard, the way children sit down when something they have been holding up finally puts itself down, and she looked at the surface of the table and did not say anything. And Ruth could see her jaw working. "Nora," Ruth said. "I'm fine," Nora said, which was true and also not the whole truth. Ruth sat beside her and put an arm around her, and Nora leaned into it with the full weight of 7 years old, that had been carrying more than 7 years old, should have to carry. And Ruth held her without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that was more useful than being held. Della came in behind Emmy and looked at the scene and absorbed it, and went directly to the stove to continue what Ruth had started, because Della's form of consideration was always practical. Emmy stood inside the door. She was looking at the kitchen table. More specifically, she was looking at the wooden horse. Jesse was sitting at the table. He looked at Emmy. Emmy walked to the table. She picked up the horse. She held it for a moment, and then she held it out toward Jesse, not giving it to him, not placing it on his side of the table the way she had done before, but offering it to his hand directly, waiting for him to take it. Jesse reached out and took it. He held it in his palm the way Ruth had held it on the courthouse steps, looking at it. This rough, small thing that had traveled through all of it. Emmy watched him hold it. Then she opened her mouth, and she said quietly, with the particular care of someone using a mechanism they have not used in a while and are testing for function, Papa. The kitchen was completely silent. Della stopped moving at the stove. Nora lifted her head from Ruth's shoulder. Jesse went very still in the way that only meant something large was happening inside him that he did not have any system yet for processing. Emmy looked at him. She said it again, slightly steadier this time. "Papa." Jesse looked at her. His hand closed around the wooden horse. He said, "Yeah." His voice was not entirely even. He did not try to make it even. "Yeah, that's yeah." Emma climbed up into the chair beside him with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a child who has made a decision and is implementing it. She sat. She looked at the table. She looked at the horse in Jesse's hand. "Mine," she said, third word. Jesse looked at the horse. He said it's on the table between them, with the careful placement of someone returning, something that belongs to someone else. Emmy put her hand on it. "Yours," he said. Nora made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, and was mostly just the sound of relief finding the fastest exit available. Ruth pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Della put a pot on the stove with a firmness that suggested she was maintaining normalcy through will and cast iron. And she said, without turning around, "Supper in 20 minutes, and that was exactly the right thing." Ruth looked at her family at the kitchen table, this strange, assembled, improbable collection of people who had found each other through necessity, and stayed through something more than that, and she thought about all the things that had been required to get them here. The letter in the post office, the back door at 4 in the morning, the blizzard and the fence and the root cellar, and the horse's leg and the march to a county clerk's office in February, and the courtroom today, and every small daily decision in between. None of it had been graceful. None of it had been the version of the story you would write if you were writing it for beauty. It had been cold and difficult and frequently uncertain, and she had made mistakes in it, and Jesse had made mistakes in it, and the mistakes were still there. In the record, unrevised. But Emmy had spoken, and Nora had put her whole weight down, and Jesse Hawkins was sitting at his kitchen table, holding a small wooden horse, and looking at it like it was something he intended to keep. The things that hold, Ruth thought, are rarely the things you planned for. They are the things you built in the available material, with the people who were there in the time you actually had. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Della said 20 minutes again, with additional emphasis, and Ruth got up to help.